Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Grace Martineau. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst for Housing at the Assembly of First Nation. It's a recent position that I accepted a number of weeks ago after serving 20 years, almost 20 years with OFNTSC, and I see some of my colleagues here, so good to see you again. It was a hard decision, but it's been great so far. And one of the things that I did commit to was doing this presentation. And I'm very grateful to be here on the territory of Fort William First Nation in the Treaty 3 area. Today I'll be speaking about the Housing Policy Toolkit 3.0, which has been recently with some new additions and some revisions and some new sections added to it. So I'm going to speak on that on behalf of Somat Tribal Council because they were unable to make it today. So the Somat Tribal Council Housing Policy Toolkit was a project that came out of a need for some housing policy templates a number of years ago. Specifically, their Coast Salish communities who are clients of the Somat Tribal Council. They got together and said, you know what, if we had some decent policies that we can work from, that are kind of standardized and we can pick and choose things that we can put into our policies, that would be great. Something, a template that we can just use. So this is what they ventured off to do. With some funding received by Indian Affairs, or I think it was AANDC at that time. I think maybe, and Somat Tribal Council with the help of various organizations like OFNTSC, the Assembly of First Nations, and some independent consultants. We all contributed to the original policy toolkit. So what is it? So the toolkit is an open source document, meaning that it's available to everybody. And it's a comprehensive package of a housing policy, its agreements, appendices, definitions, and the whole toolkit also contains some new sections as well, which I'll get into. It's free for everybody to use. I'll just advance the slide. Free to everyone to use. It's comprehensive. There's lots of detail. There's lots of definitions that you can be covered, and it's easy to work with. Believe it or not, it is easy to work with and user friendly. But I'll get into that further down the presentation as well. As I've indicated. The team who they consulted with to make sure that they had that national perspective. So with the perspectives of, I don't know who it was at the Assembly of First Nations at that time, and then me with the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation and a few others, and one from the Ontario Land Managers Association, we all got together and through our knowledge and experiences in working with our communities, contributed to this, to the document. So it made for that broad perspective. So the perspectives wasn't just biased to the Coast Salish communities. So the new toolkit now comprises of a new section called Exploring Housing Authorities Toolkit. So it's Exploring Housing Toolkit, a break-even budget toolkit, and a housing policy toolkit. So the Exploring Housing Toolkit talks about or describes housing authorities of different types and models, and their pros and cons. So you're likely familiar with your typical housing committee model. I know that many communities use this model. So that model is indicated in there, and it'll tell you about using that housing committee model, the pros of using that, the cons of using it. But I know that more communities are looking for different models that they could consider. What can we be doing different in our communities? How can we deliver our housing so that it's at arm's length from chief and council, for example? How can we make sure it's fair and balanced? So by looking at different models of authority, you can pick a model, look at it, and see if it fits within the direction your community is heading into. So the Housing Authority's Toolkit, as indicated, it does talk about the pros and cons. But it comes as a complete package on its own. So it will come with perhaps you could do a one-day workshop. It has a PowerPoint presentation, handouts, and an engagement package you can go use to consult your community. And the breakout information packages. So it kind of outlines a whole day workshop for you when you're starting to explore different models of how you can deliver your housing in your communities. Another component of the Housing Policy Toolkit is the break-even budget toolkit. So this is something that's quite new to the toolkit package. So it goes over, well, the break-even budget. What is it, and how to use it, and when to use them. Zero-cost housing. What is it? How would you get zero-cost housing in your community? And then it continues on to discuss your 5-year housing budget. It has Excel sheets, condition review forms, and then discusses your pre-1997 CMHC agreements and your post-agreements. And then, of course, the discontinuing your LEMs, which are your lower end of the market rentals. So it's quite, even this, the break-even budget toolkit on its own, or the component of the toolkit, is quite comprehensive. Any questions so far? So here's some of the questions that the toolkit does answer for you. What is a replacement reserve? I know under the CMHC programs you are required to have a replacement reserve. So what is it, and how do you get a replacement reserve, and how do you keep it? How do you maintain it? What other programs are available that could assist you in doing this? And then the final component to the toolkit is the Housing Policy Toolkit. And of itself, the toolkit is quite comprehensive. It introduced in there is a gap analysis, home ownership provisions, your housing committee terms of references, your shelter policy information kit, should you have a shelter available in your community or considering one. And then, of course, it continues to talk about what could impact your policies, like matrimonial property rights, criminal record checks, your human rights. All these things are considered in that toolkit package. And 2.0 is your rent or rent-to-home, rent or rent-to-own, and then, of course, the new modular design. Or it's in a new modular design, rather. So Toolkit A, with the housing gap analysis tools, general housing policy provisions. So we get the general template umbrella policy. So you have your general policy, which it's your standalone document, it's your general policy. And appended to that are your agreements and other sources of contracts that you can attach, or rather you would attach your policy to those agreements, which are contracts, and we'll talk about those later on. And then, of course, the rent and rent-to-own policy provisions. And it has 25 sample policy frameworks for you to look at and review. Agreements, rent-to-own, sublease, and arrears, and then within the appendix. Home ownership policy provisions. Home ownership was one of the last part of this module that to be developed. So it speaks about it has sample policy frameworks that talk about your home ownership options, the sale and purchase, your land tenure options table, and home financing options. So it's comprehensive in delivering a home ownership option for your community members. Shelter policy, as indicated, if you're considering a shelter in the community or you have one, you can set up a shelter policy for that. And the Housing Committee Terms of Reference provisions, that's a template that you can use. So that was an overview of what is inside this comprehensive toolkit. There's a lot. I didn't even discuss what was actually in it. It's a huge, huge document. But how do you use this policy? Because it can be quite overwhelming. So so the housing policy analysis would be one of the first things that you can do. And it's great so that you can assess your current policy and compare it to what it will show you where your policy is and where it's strong and where it's weak. It's a checklist where you can check off various sections and you can make notes. Does it have things like, does your current policy have like definitions? You can check it off. You have definitions. Do you have, does it talk about authority within your policy or applicable laws? Does it mention anything about criminal activity or human rights and appeals procedures? These are all things that the gap analysis will ask you, and you can actually go and check it off whether or not your policy is addressing those areas. And there's also a gap analysis for rental agreements and your rent-to-own agreements. And I think there's a sample. I do have a sample of the rental agreement analysis a few slides down. As I said, it's a huge document and it's quite overwhelming, and it's a huge, huge process to be looking at your policy, whether you're starting from new or taking your existing policy, dusting it off, and then seeing what you can do with it. It's a huge endeavor. But the toolkit offers tips and tricks that you can use when you start considering looking at your policy and actually using this toolkit. It considers a multi-stream or piecemeal approach. So you can take the document and just use it, input your community's name, wherever, revise it to your needs, and it's done. Or you could take your policy and whatever your policy needs, you can take it out of the toolkit and put it into yours. That's how it was built. It was built for you to work at it like that. Some areas have taken this as doing a circuit rider approach, so taking the policy from community to community and just keep going around in a circuit rider way and building your policy in that way. And of course, we always want to make sure that there is buy-in with your leadership, maybe with your housing committee to develop a work plan. Okay, we're going to commit to developing a policy. Let's do a work plan. First of all, how is our terms of reference? Does our housing committee have a terms of reference? Let's do that first. Get our terms of reference, set up our housing committee, and then let's look at that policy. Make those commitments. Use, when you decide to use the toolkit, use 2 monitors. I know at work, I have 2 monitors on the go, one that I'm working from and one that for reference if I need to, or if I'm copy and pasting. I have my current document here, if my housing policy is here, okay, I'm using it up. Over here, I've got the housing policy toolkit. So I'm taking from the housing policy toolkit and I can actually cut from there or copy from there and paste into my document. The 2 monitors makes it much easier to manipulate both ways. Highly recommended. Identify a gatekeeper or somebody who's going to have control of those documents. You don't want somebody to come in there and make changes or delete pages or do something to the document, because it's a lot of work. One point person or a team of people to gatekeep that policy. We use Dropbox a lot. That's another way of doing it. Yeah, it's just a basic common sense tips that you can use. So the housing policy toolkit, when it was developed, I talked about the team with OFN, TSC, Assembly of First Nations, the Land Managers Association, but there was also money in the budget to hire a firm, a lawyer firm, a legal firm, Woodward and Company, who provided the legal expertise throughout the whole process development. So the policy document has legal advice. However, when you're doing your own policy, we still recommend that you get that legal advice to make sure that you're hitting all the areas right and meeting the needs of your communities. The legal cost will be much, much lower because you're not reinventing the wheel, so to speak. But highly recommended to get legal advice. And of course, we always recommend a community buy-in. We've got community leadership buy-in, but now let's get the community buy-in. We need to engage our community and consult with our community members about this housing policy and get their endorsement. Keep your policies current. So we know that our policies outside of our communities and our laws and regulations are always changing. So we want to make sure that our policies remain current to those. to those changes. And one way to do this is by reviewing your housing policy periodically to make sure. So maybe take certain areas and say, okay, how is this area? Is it up to date? Are we good? Oh no, we heard that this was changing. Let's make sure your policy is current. And it could require maybe reviewing once or twice a year, or when you know that changes have taken place. So the sample templates must be carefully and completely reviewed and adapted to reflect the requirements of your community. This is really important because you want to make sure that all communities are unique. Sure, we know what the issues are, and a lot of communities have the same problems, but perhaps the solutions are different, and because your communities are different, they're unique, and making sure that the policy, you could use the policy toolkit and just put your name in there, but it's better that it reflects the needs of your community. That's really important. In the toolkit itself, you'll see highlights in yellow, and that will mean you can just put your specific information in the yellow. And in red, you either consider them or select them or delete them. So it's very specific on where you can make changes to it and to make that your own. So here, all policies are prospective. In other words, they're not retroactive. So policies are only good on the day that you adopt them and implement them. I think that's really important. And to know the laws and your legal obligations surrounding your policy and your agreements, and then we'll talk about that. And then just a little bit about cutting and pasting, about the formatting. Make sure that the formatting is clear. I know that when I cut and paste from one document to another, the formatting gets all messed up. So really, really watch that. And the reason why we want to make sure that you're careful when you're cutting and pasting is because how things could be, how it could be interpreted down the road. Working with the text boxes. So the text boxes show up throughout the document, and they're to form. They provide information for you, so they're meant to be deleted outside of the document. So you wouldn't cut and paste those text boxes. Also, it talks about the password protect fillable forms and how to work with them if you don't already know how to do that. What else? Making sure all the hyperlinks are updated. So hyperlinks periodically change as well. So make sure your hyperlinks are current and your table of contents are current. So if you do make changes, make sure you go back, okay, does our table of contents match all of our pages? Because if you need to reference your policy down the road, you want to make sure that you're able to point out that particular page instead of having to do a long search on that. So it's important to have that written tenancy agreement. And it's important because it's your tenancy agreement is your contract between your housing and your tenant or home occupant. And it's not legally enforceable otherwise. So if there happened to be a court challenge in your community concerning your housing, and somebody in your community sues the band, for example, your tenancy agreement will it will determine the end result. So in other words, it overrules all decisions. Your tenancy agreement will rule. It governs. So it's really important to have that tenancy agreement and make sure that it's right. So the housing agreement gap analysis tool, I previously talked about this. So similar to the housing policy gap analysis, this one specifically looks at your agreement. So you would take the gap analysis toolkit, put it on one monitor, or you can print it off. Although it's quite, oh no, the gap analysis is just a few pages. Print that off, get your agreement, and look at the different components of what the gap analysis is asking, and compare it against your policy to note its where your agreement has strengths, where or moderate or weak, where it's weak. It's really good tool to make sure that your agreement is comprehensive. So here's a sample of the gap analysis tool agreement. So it talks about, if you were to look at your housing policy, you would look at, well, again, the authority. Where's the authority? Is it mentioned in your agreement? Tenant information, of course, name and address. Things like term and termination, authorized occupants, rent, security deposits, failure to pay rent, abandonment, vehicles and parking, emergency repairs. So does your agreement talk about any of these things? Perhaps you'll want it to, and then you can make notes. Okay, we'll need to cover off this area, and it's non-existent. We'll need to discuss this. So using the gap analysis toolkit is handy when you're revising your agreement, because now you have the toolkit. You take this analysis tool and say, okay, these are the areas we need to focus on, and we take those areas out of the policy toolkit template, copy and paste those, and put them into your agreement. That way, and then you can check it off. So it's a good little tool to have to do your comparisons. Once you think you've got your agreement finalized, you take it to your lawyer and say, okay, here's our agreement. What do you think? And get that reviewed and say approved, and then take it back to your community and say, this is our agreement. This is what you need to sign. And it just continues, so it's got a couple of pages. There might be specific items that are specific to your community, because your community is unique from other communities. There might be something in there that you might want addressed in that in your agreement or your policy. then that's where you would make that note in here. Well, the policy toolkit doesn't address this, we want to. That's where you can put in your own needs in your agreement. And then once you're completed the analysis, your comparisons, you can use that and guide your priorities as you update your agreement. So that's a quick overview of this of the housing policy toolkit. We didn't want to pull up very much on the toolkit itself because it is quite large and it is quite overwhelming. It really, really is. But it's a toolkit for your use. It'll help you to make sure that you have a good quality document that you can refer to. It's legal, and it gives you some equity and balance in your community when you're making those housing decisions in your housing delivery. It's I had a few communities that took a look at it, I think maybe last year, and they said, no, we can't do this. It's way too overwhelming. You'd look at it and go, whoa, what am I going to do with this? I mean, so it is overwhelming, but don't be overwhelmed. You know what? Pick your areas you want to work on. Maybe perhaps just do the basics. So the basics would be your agreement and your general policy. That's it. Start with that. Set up your housing committee. Start small, because this is going to take you a long time. It's a long process. I know communities who are doing this, it's taking them years just to get their agreement and their general policy in order and accepted. But it's really important to do that. You know, go through that. Once you figure you want to start with the basics, say your agreement or your general policy, just focus on that. Don't focus on anything else. Don't look at the rent-to-own, home ownership. Don't look at your authority models. Just concentrate on your agreement and getting that going with your general policy. I mean, they go hand in hand. And make sure that your agreement your mentions the policy, because the policy on its own doesn't have a legal leg to stand on. It's your agreement that does. So make sure that they go hand in hand. Make sure your agreement speaks to your policy. That way you're covered. If you can find somebody to help you do this, that would be great. And I'm not saying to hire a consultant, but you know what? Look to your tribal councils or people who know that are good at policy, or come up with a team. I know we do a lot with working groups at even at the federal level. Working groups are great because we always say more brains are better than one. Let's work together. We can do this. It's going to take time to work through that toolkit. Just scroll through it slowly. If you're going to work on that basic agreement and policy, just scroll that slowly and go through that document. Okay, this is where we want to start, and then come up with a plan. I know that you can do it. It is overwhelming, but housing in First Nations is overwhelming anyway. We know that. Our housing managers are overwhelmed. So, and I know they can do it. I have faith. Anyways, I did give out a housing policy toolkit request form. We ask that you fill this out because what they do is just track. So far, there are over 300 communities who have access to this toolkit across Canada. And what that does is that they'll email you any of the updates. So they're doing the job for you. So if If something should change in one of the components of that policy, they're going to email you an update to that. So it makes it easier for you. It's an open source document, meaning that you can take this document and use it as your own. Compliments of Not So Much Tribal Council and their team. It's, I mean, you can ask for much more. So if you're interested in it, fill out the form and give it to me at the end. If there aren't enough forms, there's some paper on the table. Just put your name and contact information, and I'll make sure that you're on the list. So thank you very much. And I know I'll be discussing this probably more at, we're having the Assembly of First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Forum, March 10th, 11th, and 12th in Toronto. So I hope to see you. I hope to see you there. Some of you, all of you. It would be good to chat with you again. And thank you very much. I appreciate it. Hi. Any questions or anything? No, not you. I told you not to. Yeah, go ahead. I'm just kidding.
Good morning. Good presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
I guess we're in a process, Long Lake 58, of revising our policies. It's very important, I think, to have policies. The legality of it is very, you got to really make sure that your I's and E's and whatever, make sure that they're all in order and whatever. When I had a meeting with Chief and Council, we were butting heads in regards to the matrimonial law.
Yeah.
I know one area of it has, I know the union has been implemented a matrimonial law, but for some reason the legality, it oversees each other. So we're trying to find a way to, you know, what do we really follow? We don't really, I know your community, you follow whatever, you know, your community, but I mean, the legality part of it, you have to follow, you know, but.
If you don't have one, if you don't have your own matrimonial property laws, you have to follow the government's.
That's what I mean, yeah. So, I mean, like, the union has one as well, too.
Yep,
and,
they do.
But I mean.
I would use that,
follow?
actually, Scott, and it's a template, too. I would use theirs, use the unions, and just adapt it to your specific needs. That's what that's there for, absolutely. Because if you don't have matrimonial property laws, you have to follow the government's laws, and that was in effect a couple of years ago. So we always try to encourage communities to do their own. And I believe the Ontario or the Land Managers, National Land Managers Association has templates as well that you could refer to. Any other questions? Jason, hi.
Is the document just templates, or are there actual guidelines that go along with telling you how to fill it out? And also, you mentioned there was financing options or financing ideas for home ownership, but is it even beyond home ownership as well?
It's all that, yeah. It has everything that you just described, yeah. It's comprehensive. It has everything in there, yeah. Appendixes, definitions, references. It covers off. If there's something left out, I will be very surprised. And I've gone through a lot of it. In fact, I've gone through all of it, but I haven't noticed anything that was that seemed missing. Yeah. But the housing finance options are only what options are okay. What's available from the government. Perhaps it may suggest other ways of raising revenue in your communities, but no, yeah, that's pretty much. Any other questions? No? Thanks again, everyone. I appreciate it. Miigwech, hi.
Thank you. And